Your job's on the line if you can't translate this in 5 minutes.
Scott, my manager, tosses a mountain of Japanese documents onto my desk. Even though we're a global company, communication in Japanese is still necessary, even at our New York office. But this feels like pure harassment. The fact that it's all on paper makes me think he's stuck in the Stone Age, and just reading through this pile would take at least 30 minutes. And really, why should he have the authority to fire me in the first place? I shoot him a sly grin and lock eyes with him. Do you even have the authority to fire me? No offense, but you're just a manager, aren't you? As expected, Scott freezes, caught off guard. Just then, the sound of high heels and several footsteps echoed down the hallway. The moment the door opens, a woman with jet black hair runs straight up to me and hugs me tightly. Naturally, I embrace her back, exchanging a light greeting kiss. Everyone in the room stares in shock as their gazes shift to the group of brawny men standing behind her. My name is Alan Smith, 42 years old. I usually live in Japan, but my work takes me to various countries. Even so, there are still many places I haven't visited, and I can't help but feel just how vast the world truly is. Right now, due to certain circumstances, I'm back in my birthplace, the United States. However, even though I've returned, I don't feel much nostalgia for America. The truth is, I don't have many fond memories of my childhood here. My parents divorced when I was in first grade, leaving just my father and me. The absence of my mother made our home feel cold and empty, and I grew bitter. But during that time, a Japanese woman who was staying with a family in the neighborhood was kind to me, and I quickly grew attached to her. As I spent more time with her, I naturally began to pick up Japanese. In this way, even though I was born in the US as an American, I was exposed to Japanese culture and language extensively during my childhood. It might sound dramatic to call it fate, but it felt as if some greater force was trying to tie me to Japan. And then, as if to seal the deal, my mother unexpectedly reached out to me when I was in 8th grade, inviting me to come to Japan. By then, she had remarried to a Japanese man and was working in the fashion industry in Japan. When it was time to decide on my high school plans, my homeroom teacher, my father, and I sat down for a discussion.
Alan is incredibly intelligent and capable. He'll succeed at anything he puts his mind to. Opportunities like this are rare. I know it might be hard for you, but I think he should go to Japan.
Well, if Alan leaves, I'll find a way to manage. The one thing I won't do is stand in the way of my son's future.
After listening to the adults and thinking it over deeply, I decided to go to Japan. It felt like an experience I could never have if I stayed in America. At first, I was completely lost, unsure of anything. But fortunately, my fluency in Japanese gave me a significant advantage. Apparently, the woman who had taught me Japanese came from an upper-class background, so my Japanese was elegant and sophisticated. Rumors even began to circulate that I might be descended from nobility, and I occasionally received invitations into the world of high society. But my philosophy has always been one of equality. Whether someone is a noble who's never known financial struggles or an immigrant working hard to make ends meet, I see them all as respectable individuals. Living this way naturally drew people to me, and by the time I was in college, I had built an extensive network of connections. After graduating, I joined one of Japan's top department store chains. And that's where I met Arisa. She was a stunning woman with jet black hair, as beautiful as a movie star. For someone like me, short and a little on the chubby side, she felt far out of my league. But Arissa was head over heels for me, and I too came to see her as someone I wanted to cherish with all my heart. After a year of a smooth and happy relationship, I married Arissa, and my life was fulfilling both personally and professionally. Then, trouble arose. A whistleblower report revealed issues at the American branch of our company. To verify the truth of the matter firsthand, I decided to infiltrate the American branch myself. This time, the target was Scott Redford, the sales manager of the American branch. Scott graduated from a prestigious national university in Japan and started his career at a major bank. 5 years ago, he was recruited from the bank to help establish the American branch of our company. A year later, he was appointed sales manager. Now, 38 years old and single. He's not a heavy drinker or anything, but he's not exactly sociable either. He has no friends to hang out with after work. According to the report sent to Japan, he seems to have a policy of avoiding unnecessary interactions with other employees. From this point on, I need to stay close and investigate what kind of person he is and what exactly the issues might be. I considered sending one of my subordinates, but since this issue occurred in America, I decided to take the lead myself. Thus, I set foot in America for the first time in a long while. The distinct atmosphere of America enveloped me. To be honest, I'm not particularly fond of this air. If it weren't for work, I wouldn't consider staying here for an extended period. For now, I sent my luggage to the hotel, hailed a cab, and headed straight to the American branch. Our U.S. branch operates 3 locations in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles, and is recognized as a major company even in the American market. Although we haven't been in America for long, our brand has gained popularity as a part of Japanese culture, generating substantial profits, especially during holidays and special occasions. The taxi carrying me stopped in front of our 7-story corporate building. I'd heard that the sales department was on the 5th floor, so I took the elevator straight there. The floor was fairly spacious, with enough distance between desks to provide some breathing room. However, I couldn't help but think that the lack of partitions between workstations might be a slight issue. For now, I headed toward the manager's desk at the back and called out to Scott. "My name is Alan Smith. As of today, I've been assigned to the sales department at the American branch. I'm a mid-career hire, so there are still many things I need to learn, but I'll do my best. I look forward to working with you."
Oh, so you're the guy I heard about. I was expecting someone a bit more impressive looking, but you're just a short, stocky old man. Well, no time to waste. We're heading to a client's office, so you'll be driving.
The documents I had handed over to Scott intentionally omitted my exact academic background, presenting me simply as a mid-level employee. From day one, I played the role of an incompetent rookie. Even with a GPS, I struggled on the roads of America, which had changed drastically since the last time I drove here. Not knowing any back roads, I ended up being 15 minutes late to the appointment, despite leaving early. The client didn't seem particularly bothered, but Scott's anger was intense, turning the car ride back into something straight out of hell. He berated me in English the entire way, jabbed me in the ribs with his elbow, and even slapped the back of my head with his hand. To make matters worse, there were still 3 more clients I had to visit for introductions. By the time I finished writing the reports and returned to the hotel, I collapsed into bed, sleeping like a rock. Despite being treated as nothing more than a chauffeur on my first day, I began gathering information under Scott's nose. I actively joined my sales department colleagues for drinks, gradually learning more about the internal dynamics and relationships within the office. During one such drinking session, one of the employees grumbled,
I don't know what kind of achievements got him to where he is, but having a guy like that as a boss is a nightmare. I honestly don't see anything remotely competent about him.
Exactly. He has no compassion for his subordinates, and there's nothing about him that feels approachable, but he's incredibly good at nitpicking others' faults. It's gotten to the point where just coming to work feels dreadful.
In any case, Scott's reputation within the sales department was abysmal. Given his academic background and previous job, he could be considered a so-called elite, and he was certainly aware of it. However, working with him revealed that his only standout skill was taking credit for others' accomplishments. His actual abilities seemed far lower than what the public or recruiters in the industry might expect. Spending more time near him, I also realized that Scott was quite the Japanophile. Perhaps the reason he accepted the offer to join the company was simply because the headquarters was in Japan. During breaks, he would brew green tea with an expensive-looking teapot and indulge in it as if it were some grand ritual. But his Japanese was difficult to understand. Whenever someone spoke better Japanese than him, his hostility would be palpable, so the other employees were careful around it. One day, I had the opportunity to answer a work call and spoke in Japanese for a while. When I hung up and looked up, there was Scott standing beside me, his face twisted into a terrifying expression.
You never mentioned you could speak Japanese. Have you lived in Japan for a long time?
No, not really. I just enjoy Japanese movies, that's all.
Don't lie. There's no way watching movies could make you that fluent. You don't trust your boss, do you? Fine. If that's the case, I'll treat you accordingly.
From that day on, Scott became openly hostile toward me. He started assigning me unnecessarily time-consuming tasks, turning my workload into a grueling nightmare. Just because I was more proficient in Japanese than he was, he resorted to these petty acts of harassment. It only proved how small-minded he truly was. Scott seemed determined to convince everyone around us that my Japanese skills weren't as good as they seemed. Of course, no one else cared who spoke better Japanese, but for Scott, it was a monumental issue. That afternoon, a video conference with the headquarters in Japan was scheduled, limited to department heads. Exhausted from pulling an all-nighter to input data into the computer, I was already at my limit. Then Scott approached my desk and dumped a mountain of Japanese documents onto it.
If you can't translate this in 5 minutes, you're fired.
Apparently, the documents were materials for the meeting with the headquarters that Scott had volunteered to handle entirely on his own and then had someone print out. But this could only be described as harassment. The fact that it was all on paper made him seem outdated, and the sheer volume, enough to take 30 minutes just to read through, was ridiculous. Even the most talented translator couldn't finish this in 5 minutes, and the meeting was fast approaching. I felt an uncontrollable surge of anger. Repeatedly harassing a coworker just because we didn't get along, threatening to fire me. This was the behavior of an incompetent man. And why should I, of all people, have to fear being fired by someone like him? By now, I had already completed my mission of gathering all the data related to the misconduct at the American branch. Everything that needed to be done was done, and in a few days, I planned to vanish without a trace. After that, I'd leave the rest to the experts and wait for the report back in Japan. But before that, I wanted to see Scott utterly frustrated. I intentionally put on a sly grin and stared directly at him. Do you even have the authority to fire me? No offense, but aren't you just a manager? Even Scott couldn't hide his discomfort, suppressing a grunt. Just then, the sound of high heels and numerous footsteps echoed down the hallway. The moment the door opened, a woman with jet black hair rushed in and threw her arms around me. I instinctively embraced her and greeted her with a light kiss, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Everyone in the room turned pale as they noticed a group of brawny men standing behind her. The woman with jet black hair was none other than my wife, Arissa. Standing at 5 feet 9 inches with strikingly bold features, she always stood out in a crowd. She's 38 now, but during her late teens and early 20s, she had juggled school with a career as a model. As embarrassing as it is to admit, I'm only 5 feet 7 inches tall and have a stocky build. Whenever the two of us went out together, we often received curious stares. Not that it mattered to either of us. We couldn't care less what others thought. I had told Arissa that I was on a business trip and returned to America alone, making sure to video call her every night from the hotel. She's a bit of a clingy person, and every night she'd tell me, I wish she'd come home soon, which was honestly a little difficult to handle. And then, as it turns out, she couldn't bear the loneliness any longer and came to America herself. In fluent English, Arissa spoke to me, exasperated but playful.
If you were going to come to America, why didn't you bring me along? You know how much I love America.
You're right. I'm sorry, but this is an important job. Even if we had come together, I wouldn't have been able to spend much time with you.
I'm fine being left alone. Just being in the same place as you, breathing the same air, makes me happy.
When Arissa speaks English, she directly translates the first words that come to mind in her native language. Because of that, her English can sometimes sound a bit dramatic or overly poetic. Still, whether in English or Japanese, her love for America always comes through in a way that's pleasant to hear. Maybe I'm biased because I'm in love with her, but I tend to be more forgiving when it comes to evaluating her language skills. At that moment, Scott cut in.
Arissa, didn't you hate America? When I asked you out, you turned me down, saying, that's why I don't like Americans.
I never said I disliked all Americans. I just don't like you. I've always loved America as a country and its culture. But I didn't marry Alan because he's American. I married him because he's Alan.
Arissa has always had a deep admiration for America. She even graduated from one of the public EVs in America. I was genuinely surprised to learn that Arissa and Scott had met before. She had once told me about a male classmate who persistently pursued her during college, but I never imagined that person was Scott. Arissa first came to America when she was in 3rd grade. Her father was a huge admirer of America, but he moved his family to America to seek medical treatment for his frail wife, Arissa's mother. Miraculously, after continued treatment, her mother's health improved rapidly, and within a year, she had made a full recovery. Deeply moved by this, Arissa's father developed a strong attachment to America and began visiting frequently. Arissa, too, grew to love the country that had healed her mother and eventually came back as an exchange student in middle school. When it was time for high school, she chose to stay in America instead of returning to Japan. Her striking beauty, jet black hair, and elegant features quickly made her well known in high school, and she later went on to attend an American university. That's why she speaks fluent English and can communicate with me so effortlessly. Maybe, in some way, the fact that I'm American was part of the reason she chose to marry me. But considering she passed over someone like Scott, who could be considered conventionally handsome, and instead chose someone as plain-looking as me, I have to say, Arissa is definitely one of a kind. Scott clearly wasn't happy about it.
Why him? How did I lose to a guy who looks like that? What kind of tricks does a man like you have to pull to win over a woman like her?
I don't really know what to tell you. Maybe it's just that, for Arissa, I was the one, and for me, she was the only one on this planet. Scott's jaw dropped in disbelief, his expression frozen in shock. That's when I finally realized that the surrounding employees had been listening to the entire exchange. I felt a bit embarrassed, but at this point, it was time to reveal my true identity to everyone. Luckily, Scott ended up doing it for me, so I didn't have to say a word.
You're married to Arissa? That means you're part of the executive board, aren't you? I knew the chairman had a thing for America, but I never imagined he'd let his daughter marry someone like you.
Executive board? No, I hold the highest position here. The former chairman collapsed, and his son-in-law stepped in as his successor. As an employee, you should already know that, shouldn't you? Arissa's father, my father-in-law, was the chairman of this department store chain. From the moment I married Arissa, it was already decided that I would eventually take on the responsibility of leading the company. Scott looked utterly baffled, his expression frozen in disbelief.
What makes you and me so different? I'm a serious man, and I have the height to stand next to Arissa without embarrassing her.
Oh, so what you're really trying to say is that you're handsome? You're ridiculous. Women don't choose their husbands based on height or looks. At least, I don't. And honestly, marrying Alan has made me the happiest woman in the world.
Scott was left speechless, unable to come up with a retort. Scott, who had always been a fan of Japanese culture, now found himself face to face with a tall, jet black-haired beauty of the same age as him. What's more, they had been in the same university and the same department. It was impossible for her not to catch his eye. It wasn't hard to imagine that plenty of confident men had confessed their feelings to her back then. But Arissa had never thought of herself as particularly beautiful. She was completely indifferent to her own looks. Scott had, to some extent, already made peace with the fact that it was all in the past. What bothered Scott more was the fact that I, the chairman of the company, had gone out of my way to return to America and engage in what seemed like espionage. Scott refrained from persistently pressing the issue about Arissa and instead redirected his focus and frustration toward me.
Why did you hide your identity and show up in front of me like this? If you're the chairman of the company, why not just live a comfortable life in Japan?
It's true that, under normal circumstances, the only time I'd return to America would be around New Year's. However, the stage for the first major problem since I became chairman was set in America. Even though I live in Japan and have a Japanese wife, the patriotism deep within me has never disappeared. Sure, I don't hold particularly strong feelings for America, but that doesn't mean my roots have changed. They never will. Living abroad, I'm reminded every day of the fact that I am American. No matter how much I love Japan, I can never truly become Japanese. At the end of the day, I'm still an American, and there's no way I can simply ignore the country that shaped who I am. When a major scandal erupted at one of our branches here in America, a place so deeply tied to my identity, I couldn't just turn a blind eye. While I have plenty of trustworthy subordinates, I felt a strong need to see the situation with my own eyes. In reality, the issue hasn't surfaced publicly yet. Our department store chain has maintained steady sales and is gradually expanding, even amidst the unstable global economy. However, as the saying goes, a single tiny ant hole can bring down a great dam. Even the smallest issue can shake the very foundation. This mission required someone who was either American or fluent in English. So I decided that if I were to conduct an undercover investigation in America, I might as well see everything with my own eyes. That's how I volunteered for the role of spy. When I first heard Scott's name, it didn't ring a bell. As the chairman of a global department store chain, it wouldn't have been unusual for me to know the names of department heads at the American branch. However, since he wasn't a founding member of the branch, but rather someone recruited later through headhunting, I let it slide. If the allegations turned out to be true, I initially thought I might extend some leniency after considering Scott's personality. At first, I approached him with that level of kindness and understanding. But sadly, after dealing with him firsthand, it became clear that he wasn't someone deserving of such compassion. On top of that, I had no idea about his connection with Arissa during their university days. Here, I couldn't afford to make the wrong decision. Ensuring that this wouldn't negatively impact future management was critical. I lowered my gaze to Scott's wrist, noticing the watch he was wearing. By the way, are you a collector of luxury watches? You seem to have quite the knowledge about them. Scott's shoulders twitched slightly, and his face turned visibly pale.
No, I wouldn't say I have any special knowledge. I own 3 or 4 watches as a hobby, but they're not exactly the most expensive ones. Besides, with your position, you must meet Arab billionaires now and then, right? Surely their collections are far superior.
It's well known that wealthy individuals consider luxury watches as part of their assets, and those kinds of high-end timepieces aren't typically sold in regular department stores in America. The watches that American collectors covet are in the range of hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of dollars. Even at the 3 American branches of our company, watches in that price range are part of the inventory. But if those items were ever funneled elsewhere or misappropriated, it would cause a massive scandal capable of shaking the entire American branch. I fixed my gaze firmly on Scott's eyes. The reason I infiltrated the American branch was due to allegations of luxury watches being siphoned off within the branch. A whistleblower brought the issue to me as the chairman, and after discussions with the executive board, it was decided that I would conduct the investigation myself. The president of the American branch fully cooperated with this investigation, allowing me access to the hidden ledger data that Scott had been concealing. With that, I was able to secure solid evidence. I pulled a small USB drive out of my pocket and gave it a subtle wave in front of him.
Is that the hidden ledger data?
Exactly. All the evidence is right here. I nodded firmly, gripping the USB drive tightly before slipping it back into my pocket. If the former chairman finds out that such corruption was taking place at the American branch he loved so much, he would be heartbroken. On top of that, I've also gotten a good look at the atmosphere within the branch. All of this will serve as valuable insight for the future growth of our company.
What's going to happen to me? I'm willing to accept a salary cut. Just don't fire me. When I was promoted to sales manager, I went ahead and built a house. If I'm fired, I won't be able to pay off the mortgage.
His personal circumstances, however, were none of my concern. The former chairman had chosen to establish our first overseas branch in America because of his deep affection for the country. Knowing that such an incident had occurred at the American branch would undoubtedly sadden him greatly. As an American, I felt an overwhelming sense of shame. My role here ends now. The rest will be left to the president of the American branch, so at least handle the situation with sincerity from here on out. Even while living in Japan, I've never forgotten my sense of patriotism. You too should carry both pride and responsibility for being an American.
Pride and responsibility. I think I'm starting to understand why Arissa chose you and why you're the leader of a global department store chain. There really are Americans like you out there.
Somehow, we could both sense each other's feelings in that moment. If we had met sooner, we might not have ended up as adversaries like this. I couldn't help but wonder, if Scott had met me earlier in life, perhaps he wouldn't have grown into someone so disliked by everyone. Scott didn't seem to fully realize how his sarcastic personality and petty tendencies had shaped him. Had someone pointed it out to him earlier in his life, he might have changed his way of thinking and made more friends along the way. That said, Scott was still in his 30s. I wanted to believe he still had plenty of opportunities to turn his life around. At that moment, the assistant sales manager approached me with an apologetic expression.
Well, the video conference with headquarters is about to start. What should we do?
There's no need for the meeting anymore. The issue has been resolved. Besides, the whole point of that meeting was just a distraction to keep Scott from noticing the investigation.
It's all over then. Now I finally have my Alan all to myself again.
I wrapped my arm around her waist and pulled her close, then walked out of the sales floor with confidence. Our bodyguards silently followed behind us. I would never return to this place again. The data I gathered served as undeniable proof. Luxury watches were indeed being siphoned off from the American branch. Scott had been drowning in debt, and he had orchestrated the scheme to cover his financial losses. From here on out, I would hand things over to the president of the American branch and return to my regular work. As expected, Scott was promptly fired. The case was taken to civil court, and Scott was sentenced to spend the rest of his life repaying the company. But why did Scott need so much money in the first place? As it turned out, he had become infatuated with a foreign woman who worked at a nightclub and had been funneling the embezzled money to her. Rumor had it that she bore a striking resemblance to Arissa, jet black hair and similar features. Scott had genuinely fallen for her and was even considering marriage. However, whenever the topic of marriage came up, she would skillfully dodge the conversation, keeping their relationship strictly as employee and client. She must have known that maintaining that dynamic allowed her to extract the maximum amount of money from him. In the end, the moment she found out Scott had been fired, she vanished without a trace. When I returned to Japan and reported everything, my father-in-law simply sighed and said, "It's a story as old as time." He reassured me, adding, "This won't make me hate America." His words reminded me of my responsibility, not just to him, but to all the employees working for our company worldwide. I knew I had to work even harder. As for what became of Scott afterward, I began hearing rumors from employees at the American branch. He needed to find another job to pay back the company, but securing employment proved difficult. On top of that, after pouring so much money into his dream woman, only for her to disappear without a word, he developed a deep mistrust of women. His life spiraled downward. Unable to make ends meet, he was ultimately forced to sell the brand new house he had just purchased. Perhaps that home was meant to be the place where he and the woman he adored would start their life together. Even then, Scott was still far from repaying his debts. In desperation, he turned to underground lenders. Their collection methods were ruthless, and before he could fully pay back what he owed, Scott disappeared without a trace. No one knows where he is or what he's doing now. 2 years have passed since then, and our family has grown. We welcomed a daughter into our lives. Wanting a name that could also be written in Chinese characters, we named her Maria. With such an adorable granddaughter, my father-in-law has completely embraced his role as a doting grandfather. Recently, Arissa and Maria appeared in an advertisement for our globally recognized company, drawing widespread attention. Our family has now become a symbol of admiration across the world. To protect this happiness and to make it even greater, I intend to continue striving forward.